Opening scene, we see Mr. Steve Abnesti administering something called G46 into one of his patients. And his subject and patient laughs hysterically at jokes that Abnesti tells him, which are incredibly basic. They remind him that he's serving 2 consecutive life sentences, and this dude just keeps laughing. And Abnesti and his partner Mark are pretty excited because this was the result that they wanted. Okay, so to give you a little context, this place is called the Spiderhead facility, and all of the people are inmates. Very violent inmates who actually volunteered for this program. Mr. Abnesti and his buddy Mark are the only ones who are not criminals, because they experiment with drugs on the volunteers. And this is one of said inmates now. His name is Jeff.
My name is Jeff.
And he's going to this undisclosed location to try out this new drug called N40. And this drug, when administered, makes you think that whatever it is that you're seeing is the most beautiful thing in the world. Right now, Jeff is standing in front of a gross construction site, but he thinks he's looking at this amazing garden that's so green and lively. And to make him describe what he's seeing, they administer something else called Verbulence, which is something that makes you speak a lot. And after their little experiment, Jeff goes back to the facility and he hangs out with his buddy Lizzie. And Lizzie is also a criminal, and her and Jeff are on food duty. And later, in his room, Jeff gets a flashback of what he did years ago. He would relive the memory of him drunk driving and crashing into a tree. He goes back to sleep, and in the morning, he meets Heather, another inmate that he's never really interacted with, and today they're doing tests together. Before Abnesti pumps them full of the chemical that he's testing, he has to ask for their consent, and he does that every time. This time, he's administering the same drug he gave Jeff yesterday, the one called N40. He asks them what they think about each other. He asks them to rate one another, and they start to get a little awkward at first, and they start to look at each other funny. And then Abnesti pumps up the Verbluce, you know, the drug that makes you talk a lot. And at the same time, the N40, the new drug that they're testing, is still pretty high. And then all of a sudden, they start saying to each other that they're the most beautiful person that they've ever seen. And then they get it on in front of both Steve and Mark. And apparently, this drug, the N40, makes you so happy that you fall in love. And this test has proved that. After Jeff and Heather were done, Abnesti tells Mark to keep an eye on them, to see if what they just did now is an indication of real love. And after that, Jeff's feeling a little off about the meaningless encounter that he just had with Heather. And for this specific experiment, Heather was not the last one. You see, this is Sarah, and the same thing happens with her as well. And a few hours later, because he finished his vials of drugs to be tested, Mark goes to his room and administers new vials. And he tells him not to move around a lot because the Moby pack, or the thing that contains the vials that is remotely controlled by Abnesti, is not really made for collision. And speaking of Abnesti, the next day, he gets both Heather and Sarah in one room. And when you think that he's gonna run the same experiment but with 2 girls, he offers Jeff a surprise by offering him the remote. But this time, he's not really administering the euphoric, amazing N40 drug. He's administering Darkenflox. You see, Darkenflox is a drug that makes you feel incredibly sad and agitated. And Jeff has had Darkenflox before. And so when Abnesti asks him, somebody has to get the Darkenflox and you have to choose, Jeff tells him that he can't really do that to anyone. He can't administer that drug knowing full well how it makes you feel. And on Friday, on his day off, Jeff goes out to make a phone call to his girlfriend. He leaves her a voice message, apologizing for whatever it was that he did. In the morning, he gets into a room with Rogan, and Jeff gets incredibly resistant and scared, seeing that Rogan is twice his size and suspecting that Abnesti might administer the N40 that made him sleep with women. But nothing happens. After a while, Rogan leaves, and Jeff storms into Abnesti's office, and Heather was there. Jeff is angry because he thinks Abnesti gave Heather the same offer that he gave to Jeff. You know, the offer to administer Darkenflox. And that is exactly what happened. And Jeff is very angry about that. Abnesti is very disappointed, and he explains to Jeff that him being here is a privilege. Even though it's a punishment, it's a sort of a privilege. And he also explains to him that he has no say in what goes on. there is a protocol committee that makes all the decisions, and Abnesti just has to do what they say. And when Jeff hears this, he apologizes and they just move on. And at night, Mark expresses his worry about administering Darkenflox, and Abnesti tries to calm him down, tells him to go out, have some fun, and we see that Abnesti is really enjoying his work. Matter of fact, he's enjoying it so much that he's administering his own drugs into his own body. And in the morning, Abnesti seems a little on edge, a little too fidgety, too excited because he's taking his own experimental drugs. And Jeff walks in on him as Mark was changing his vials in his MobiPak. And then they go down to the lab, and this time Abnesti tells Jeff that he spoke to the committee and they said to administer the drug himself and just watch Jeff's reaction. And he also tells Jeff that the committee said that if Jeff keeps causing more problems and he keeps saying no, the committee's gonna send him back to state. And so Jeff acknowledges and they give Heather the Darkenflox. And all of a sudden she starts to get incredibly agitated, she starts to bang on the window, and while all this is going on, Jeff is describing what he feels towards her, and Abnesti is writing it down. But all of a sudden, Heather starts banging against everything, and she destroys her MobiPak, flooding her instantly with too much Darkenflox. Abnesti tells Mark to stop the flow of the drug, but Mark can't really control it anymore. And before Mark could run and get to her, Heather breaks a chair and she stabs herself in the neck with a broken piece of wood. And as soon as this happens, everybody gets freaked out. Abnesti puts his journal in one of the drawers and he locks it, puts the key in his pocket, and as he was running out to go to Heather, he drops it on the floor and Jeff picks it up. And he starts going through Abnesti's journal. And in the journal, he finds this piece of paper that says Abnesti Pharmaceuticals. And from this, Jeff learns that this is his company and there is no committee. Abnesti's calling all the shots. And just before Abnesti makes it back to Jeff, realizing that he dropped his keys, Jeff puts back the journal and pretends like he didn't see anything. And witnessing Heather do that to herself did not really go well for Mark, because he's now very skeptical about the project. But Abnesti tries to convince him otherwise, and he also tries to convince Jeff. Matter of fact, they get drunk on the N40, the one that makes you feel good, and they have a conversation. They laugh a lot, and they bond a little bit. And a day later, Abnesti administers Phobica to Lizzie. And from its name, you figure out that it's about phobias. And she loses her mind over the fear of a stapler. And later that day, she talks to Jeff about the experience and how afraid and sad she felt. And Jeff shares a little bit about her life with her, when he was drunk driving and he crashed into a tree, and both his best friend and his girlfriend died in the car because it exploded. Lizzie and Jeff bond over this experience, and she tries to tell him that it's really not his fault and he shouldn't really feel guilty. And then they bond physically, if you know what I mean. And after they were done bonding, as they were getting some food in the kitchen, Abnesti notices them and he starts spying on Jeff. And he realizes that Jeff is in love with Lizzie. And because of this nice realization, Abnesti asks Jeff the next day to administer Darkenflox to Lizzie. And of course, Jeff says no, and Abnesti tells him, hey, it's okay, just calm down, we'll try again tomorrow. And at night, as Mark was changing Jeff's MobiPak, Jeff comes clean and he tells him that he knows that this is Abnesti's company. And Jeff also asks what's really going on. And at this point, Jeff realizes that Abnesti doesn't really care about any of the drugs. Abnesti cares about one drug, the one called B6. And in the morning, Abnesti gets Jeff into the office and Mark is not there. And he gives him the controls and he asks him to administer Darkenflox to Lizzie. And again, Jeff says no. And this really pisses off Abnesti. And because he was so pissed, he decides to tell Jeff why Lizzie is actually in prison. And apparently, Lizzie killed her own daughter. She left her infant daughter in the car for 3 hours while she was at Walmart. And as she was saying this, Abnesti starts to laugh hysterically. And then he starts to get incredibly agitated and scared. Because apparently, last night, Jeff and Mark have agreed that they're gonna screw over Abnesti because he's an evil dude. And Mark's actually outside getting the police as they speak. And the remote control is now synced to Abnesti's MobiPak, and his MobiPak is full of Darkenflox. And by administering a bunch of Darkenflox, Phobica, and a bunch of the B6, Jeff makes Abnesti confess to everything. And Abnesti tells him that all of this is not really a social research, and it's really about the B6, which actually makes people do what they're told. So all the times that Jeff, Heather, Lizzie, everybody said that they acknowledged to have the the drug administered inside of them, they didn't realize that the test was their acknowledgement. Abnesti tells him that Lizzie was free to go because she got parole like months ago. And Jeff also got parole a few weeks ago, he just didn't tell them because he's a piece of shit. And after Jeff makes Abnesti open all the doors, he starts to walk away and Abnesti gets a pocket knife. Jeff asks him to hand over the knife, thinking that the B6 works, but Abnesti tells him that the B6 doesn't work against something you love, and Abnesti is in love with the lab. He tells Jeff that why he couldn't administer Darkenflux to Lizzie was because he loved her. And so, as you can guess, Jeff and Abnesti start fighting, and Abnesti takes the phone away from Jeff and he gives Lizzie so much Darkenflux she starts freaking out. But for a moment, as they were struggling, Jeff knocks out Abnesti, also destroying the Mobipack that was attached to him, and he rushes over to Lizzie and he removes all the vials of Darkenflux from her Mobipack. And as soon as they were running away, Abnesti gets up and on the speaker he tells all the inmates to stop Jeff and Lizzie. And as the inmates were trying to stop Jeff and Lizzie, Abnesti gets in a plane and he flies off. And most of the inmates couldn't reach Heather and Jeff in time, so they make it out too and they escape on a boat. And as Mark was bringing a lot of cops to the facility, he sees Abnesti flying away in a plane. But you remember how I said Abnesti's Mobipack was compromised? Yeah. At some point, as he was flying, the N40 gets into his system and it hits him real hard and he crashes into a hill thinking that it's a beautiful sunset. And that, boys and girls, is how the movie ends.